Imagine for a moment the adventurers ambling along a trail, perhaps headed to a treacherous dungeon full of treasure. Soon they'll be neck-deep in look, there's a guy coming down the trail. What should we do? Maybe it's just a chance encounter? Well, what's going to happen? I bet it's going to be a combat. It's going to be a combat, right? This video is about encounters. I started out thinking it would be about random encounters. And then I discovered something very interesting about the nature of how we find ourselves meeting things like monsters and NPCs, in particular, the distance that we spot them, the agency, or lack thereof, we have available once that tripwire of "it's an encounter now" has fired. As I began my research, I had a definition in mind of a periodic chance of crossing ways with monsters, animals, and travelers. It was an unrailroaded means for the stuff that's in the world, not the particular entities tied up with the GM's plans for the adventure, to make itself seen. This video had its beginnings over on another social media site, where people were trashing random encounters as boring and a sign of poor GMing. Filler. As an easy way to make dull sessions interesting, throwing some random combat. That's what people thought. And with that prejudice in mind, it's easy to conclude random encounters are a sign of a poor progression in a game. In a number of pillars of the CRPG genre, random battles are often a means of stretching out the storyline, feeding a trickle of XP and treasure to the player, padding out segments between major shifts of the story, or perhaps more forgivably, as a form of safeties-off practice for the player to master the mechanics of the game, a playground for trying different equipment and power sets outside of higher stakes or momentous game segments. There's some worthy criticisms. If you fill your game with filler, it does kind of suggest a lower regard for how precious of an opportunity is when we manage to get all these meat-spaced humans together around the table. And I thought, if I just went to the books, then I could stand for my, correct interpretation of random encounters. See, I've always viewed random encounters as the voice of the environment, the stuff in the world that you stumble across on your journey, a way for the GM's role as a world builder, independent of story, to get some valuable ambiance time via denizens of the world, soldiers on patrol, traders moving goods between cities. When it's important to the story, the encounter begins life carrying a burden of expedition, some kind of necessary show that the players need to be shown so that the next thing in the story is all teed up. The counterpart in random encounters, it's a way for stuff to just happen sometimes, a means to feel opportunity costs. If a party dallies too long, they might be spotted. Extra rolls on the random encounter table, traveling brazenly with your knight's banneret unfurled in the breeze, the chance of an encounter might go, oop. Those opportunity costs are felt by way of a push-your-luck mechanic. There's no certainty that if you take a little longer, or if you're quick and careful about things, or if you camp for the night, after arriving at the dungeon door, well, you might be able to rest, descend with full spells and full belly. Nobody wants to go to the dungeon saddle sore and depleted of spells. It's the chance something might come up that makes it a question worth posing to the players. It's the chance, not the certainty, that makes their decision-making and the bickering they'll do amongst themselves into an interesting and worthy use of session time. Now they're really role-playing. I thought that was the theory of random encounters I would find when I dug in and researched their story in older game manuals. Of course, I was expecting that in 3.x and 4e and 5e, they'd pass off random encounters as another shade of illusionism. Just keep folks rolling dice, razzle-dazzle them, and the GM as an entertainer. That's the dominant theory nowadays, after all, but I thought if we rolled back the calendar to the days of AD&D, my own ideal would be well supported in the text. Suffice to say, I was wrong. And that's where I fell down the rabbit hole. I found no certainty in the text. I thought random encounters existed in the context of what I called matter-of-fact gameplay. I've spoken about that in other videos, but it's suffice it to say, when stuff happens because causes precede effects, rather than because players need entertaining. Or there's a story that's going to wither on the vine if we don't force it. Well, I was rudely awakened because the theory of random encounters, their why, was presented in the text of 1st and 2nd edition AD&D as GM prerogative, to smooth out dull moments or as flippant means of taxing PC resources. Along the way, I also discovered something fundamental to the nature of encounters in the Dungeons & Dragons game itself. That was truly surprising. Since this is YouTube, and we all know how YouTube works, I'll tell you that it's time for a moment for this video's sponsor, my channel. If you like this kind of RPG content, if you want a TTRPG channel to exist on YouTube that doesn't treat you like a baby and upload videos more than once a year, I don't want you to subscribe. I don't want you to like it any more than you actually do. Instead, if you watch one of my videos about Harn, the Mr. Genius algorithm will start blasting you with videos about Pendragon or Traveler or what have you. Mine is a channel doomed to a very low click-through rate for thumbnails. But the folks who do watch, you're some of the most engaged folks. Because of this issue of video clickability, my videos are kind of specific. In other words, I struggle in this ecosystem to grow my audience. I may have 4,500 subscribers, but in reality, most of my videos don't go past 400 views as the algorithm decides it's a niche topic nobody should see a thumbnail for. So what I do ask, share this video wherever on social media you're still using it in 2024. I need help getting the word out. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Let's take a look at AD&D 2nd Edition's What's an Encounter? They're challenging the Game Master to really think about this. It's not a role-playing encounter. I think they mean it's not about acting your part, but it's more about decisions on the part of the characters. Part A, it involves something rather than just mundane life. Encountering an event, monsters, NPC. And then secondly, the possibility for meaningful change in the character's abilities, possessions, or knowledge. Quiz section where they ask you which of these 4 things is properly an encounter. Some of them are trivial encounters, nothing, burgers, inter-party conflict, but one of them, Rupert and Talus Bloodheart are riding across the plain. Just as they crest a low ridge, they see a cloud of smoke and dust in the distance. They halt and watch for a little while. The dust cloud slowly moves in their direction, while the smoke dwindles. Moving their horses to a hollow, they watch the approach of the mysterious cloud from a thicket. So that's the one that they properly define as an encounter, which is going to present some interesting questions about encounter distance and that revelation that I keep hinting about. There's a big gradient that the characters pass through from ignorance of the threat, dread of the threat. The threat approaches, and they're able to make some responses and to change their readiness. Encounters in the random sense in particular. The DM runs random encounters. They aren't tied to a specific place or event. They're based on chance. The DM makes encounter checks, rolling a die to determine if a random encounter occurs. When a check indicates an encounter is imminent, a creature or NPC determined by the encounter tables will arrive in the area in the next few minutes to investigate. Interesting. Many encounters end in combat, but this isn't necessary. It is possible to talk to intelligent creatures. Left out entirely is the idea of going to ground, just avoiding, or taking a posture which allows you to decide whether you want to fight. Gaining the tactical initiative, you might say. Very much in the vein of the debates of the present day over the merit of random encounters, AD&D 2nd Edition is also treating with whether you should use random encounters. Some argue that random encounters are foolish and should not be used. These people maintain that everything should be under the control of the DM, and that there should be no surprises for him. Interestingly, the discourse on the random encounter haters side of the table, it largely comes down to the chance that people will lose their characters, the introduction of peril, and generally the idea of senselessness. If it isn't part of the story, then it must be worthless or a waste of time. Certainly, random encounters can be abused through overuse, and they can create illogical encounters. However, when used judiciously, random encounters add to everyone's fun in a couple of ways. Interestingly here, the problem is the illogical encounter. They don't actually sketch out a framework of like what the party could do in terms of alertness or stealth, keeping a low profile that could defray those chances of a random encounter. Suffice it to say, the merits of random encounters are treated with in terms of variety, spicing things up, beyond the normal purview of the adventurer, which I spoke to earlier, and a Dungeon Master challenge that you gotta improvise some stuff that you didn't have in mind in the first place. Random encounters can also wear the player characters down. Yeah. In preparation for a larger planned encounter. What a sad way of looking at this, folks. The party has resources, and you may deplete your resources. You might, reach a lower state of readiness. Your force level might not be at the optimum. And we know that parties have an alpha strike when they're at full resources. Can they reach their target before anything gets in their way? It's part of what makes it interesting is, should we go home and try again another day? Should we push our luck? That's what random encounters can do, in my opinion. But this is from 1989, so we've got a few years on these folks.
So what's our stunning revelation? What did I discover? Recall when those two adventurers encountered a mysterious dark cloud? They had a lot of advance notice. The truth is, if you look just after we explore what a random encounter is, they tell us that random encounters happen at an absurdly close distance. And as I search my memory of playing every edition of D&D, both as a player and a dungeon master, guilty, as in, I can't think of a time that I ever had any meaningful ability to react to an encounter that far out. It was always, put your miniatures on the board, or they're literally this many feet away, usually somewhere between 60 and 100, and good luck trying to run away or find a place to hide. So much harder so in the world of tactical maps, and we're told that this is where we are. In other words, encounters are not really about choice for characters as far as fight or flight, befriend or antagonize. They're really more about forcing change. It really speaks to why people don't like random encounters, how they're forced onto. There's no threat gradient. In warfighting, there's this concept that, you're in different zones as far as your risk level. There's a contested zone where you and the enemy are in combat with one another, and there's also rear areas where your threat level goes down, or you can literally be inside the enemy battle space as when you're doing something like a probe mission, or if you're actively reconnoitering, or if you're in the act of assaulting and trying to change where the battle space control is. Go at those things with sort of foreknowledge about how you're changing and transitioning between zones. That goes a lot into who goes there and how much risk they assume unto themselves. Adventurers, they really don't have that luxury. Volunteering from the very moment you choose to go on one of these Dungeons & Dragons adventurers, that this stuff will be sprung on you at any moment without that moment to decide on your approach. We should look at how we could affect this and what other approaches to encounters there could be in the future. We should look at whether the whole paradigm of artful tactical maps is actually something that has helped the hobby as far as player agency. Whether we've taken away the choice, because this is the one map that the GM has for this encounter. And so if you go someplace else and you try and receive this force, this encounter, in another location that's more favorable to you, or if you just try and run as far away as you can until they get to you, well, do you really have that option? Do you just anger the GM and the circumstances of the beginning of the combat are that much more outside of your control? You don't tug on Superman's cape. You don't spit into the wind. That's why I think most people will look at this video and say, it's D&D, it's a combat game. What did you expect? Well, I've always tried to immerse myself in the idea of being one of those people in those dangerous situations, or just going for a walk in the woods and there's a grizzly bear. I've literally slept in a forest on the side of a fallen tree trunk, and not so many yards away from me, a black bear was having his night's sleep not so far away. I've had random encounters in my life. Over the past few years of trying to become a photographer of the wider world, you might say events and news, well, I've stumbled into some things. I actively try to stumble into things, even. The more that I look at how encounters, and especially the random ones, which don't have any bearing on the story, are approached in terms of the rules, in terms of how we don't give the game master or the players any kind of guidance, guarantees, or thoughts about what they can do once they hear it coming, once they see it coming. What options do you have? Could you cast a spell? I mean, I guess it says a few minutes in AD&D. I don't know that I've ever had those a few minutes as a player. I don't know how many times I've given those a few minutes, and it's still fewer times that I can think of that the players that I was GMing for actually used those minutes to do anything. And I think I also pulled out the battle map and forced whatever terrain onto them. Not that choosing the terrain of battle is something that I think many players think about as warfighters, as people role-playing warfighters. Because if the game's so much about combat, because it sure is, then shouldn't we think about how many of those choices are before people before we force changes? Because sometimes the change comes from the stress of having to make choices. My own experience with combat stress, my own experience of being in a battle zone, it was a lot about the fact that I was choosing to continue being in that space and what the ultimate consequences were. But this video is not about that. I hope that you're having fun in the role-playing hobby, and I hope that we can grow as game masters and see more growth in the hobby when it comes to encounters.